Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. For weeks, I had been carefully orchestrating a plan. Dropping small clues and pretending to be swamped with work, I aimed to make her believe our anniversary had slipped my mind. The intention was to create the illusion that I was too preoccupied to care, so when the surprise unfolded, its impact would be even greater. That was the theory, at least. Picking up my keys from the counter, I glanced at my watch. I was home earlier than usual, giving me just enough time to prepare everything before she returned from her yoga class. The house was calm, exuding the quiet stillness I often found comforting. Tonight, that tranquility felt like the perfect canvas for my plans. I had spared no effort. Candles cast a soft glow, and the dining table was arranged exactly as it had been the first night we'd moved in together. Maybe it was a bit extravagant, but I wanted this evening to become a memory we would treasure for years to come. I hoped to make it unforgettable. Yet, as I pulled into the driveway and turned off the car, a strange unease settled over me. The house, bathed in the warm hues of the setting sun, seemed almost unnaturally still, as though holding its breath. I shook off the discomfort, dismissing it as overthinking. There was a plan, and I needed to stick to it. As I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeted me. The faint scent of lavender hung in the air, her favorite fragrance. Everything was as it should be, orderly, tidy, just the way she liked it. The unopened bottle of wine on the counter offered reassurance. Smiling faintly, I walked through the house, my keys jangling softly in the silence. She would be back soon. A quick glance at the clock showed it was 6:15 p.m. That meant she'd likely still be at the studio for another 20 minutes. I headed toward the kitchen to finalize the details, but a faint noise stopped me in my tracks. At first, it was so quiet I thought I'd imagined it. Then it came again, clearer this time. A woman's moan. For a split second, I tried to rationalize the sound. Perhaps it came from the neighbors or a random echo from the TV. But then I heard another voice, a man's, low and intimate, alarmingly close. My pulse quickened, dread creeping in as I moved toward the bedroom without fully realizing it. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to catch a partial view. My hand rested against the cool wood, hesitating as I wrestled with whether to push it open. Fear of what I might see paralyzed me, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I nudged the door wider. The scene before me stole the breath from my lungs. There she was, her golden hair spilling across the pillow, her body tangled in the sheets. Beside her was a man I had never seen before, his face pressed close to her neck. For what felt like an eternity, time froze. My mind spun in chaotic circles, but my body refused to move. How had it come to this? Why? My breaths were shallow and uneven as the weight of betrayal bore down on me. Then her voice shattered the stillness, sharp and unmistakable. "Oh God, yes!" she gasped, her nails digging into his back. "You're so much better than him!" Her words struck with brutal precision. This wasn't just infidelity, it was deliberate and malicious. The woman I had built my life around, the person I thought I knew better than anyone, was reveling in her treachery. Time stretched unbearably as I stood frozen, a ghost in my own home, while my world collapsed around me. The man shifted slightly, and his face caught the reflection of light from the mirror. For a fleeting second, our eyes met. His widened in shock before he muttered a curse and scrambled to his feet. My wife sat up abruptly, her expression a mix of panic and confusion. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, clutching the sheets to her chest. I couldn't respond. My voice was locked behind the suffocating weight of betrayal. Slowly, I stepped into the room, my gaze unwavering. "I was surprising you," I said evenly, my tone cold and detached. "Looks like I succeeded." Her eyes darted to the man who was frantically pulling on his clothes. "Go!" she whispered urgently. "Just go!" He hesitated for a moment, glancing between us before grabbing his jacket and bolting from the room. The slam of the front door echoed through the silence, leaving just the two of us in its wake. Turning toward the window, I watched him vanish into the night. My fists clenched at my sides, anger simmering beneath the surface, barely contained by the cold clarity of my thoughts. "Who was that?" I asked, my voice sharp despite its calmness. She hesitated, her lip trembling. "It's not what it looks like," she blurted, desperation dripping from her words. A bitter laugh escaped me, foreign and hollow. "Not what it looks like?" I snapped. "You're naked in our bed with another man. What exactly am I supposed to think?" Her face crumbled as she searched for something to say, but I no longer cared. Whatever sympathy I might have once felt had evaporated. Her eyes, which had once been a source of comfort and trust, were now only a cruel reminder of how deeply I'd been betrayed. Turning away, I let the silence stretch between us. Words felt pointless. No excuse or apology could undo what had been done. I focused instead on steadying myself, on keeping my fury from erupting. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. If she thought the surprises for the night were done, she was sorely mistaken. I needed a moment to catch my breath, to untangle the mess that had blindsided me. My life felt like a delicate web torn apart, the pieces scattered beyond repair. For a brief instant, the world outside seemed to pause as if in sympathy. The house, the sky, everything stood eerily still, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. "Who is he?" I asked again, my voice heavier, each word sinking into the oppressive silence like an anchor. Her eyes darted away, avoiding mine as if doing so might lighten the burden of her confession. The guilt was written all over her face, etched into every reluctant pause. After what felt like an eternity, she finally muttered, "He's someone I met a few months ago." Her voice was barely more than a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I turned fully to face her, my gaze locking onto her tear-streaked cheeks and the smudged remnants of her makeup. But any trace of pity? It was nowhere to be found. Instead, a controlled anger simmered beneath the surface. She had crossed a boundary, one that could never be redrawn. "So you've been seeing him for months," I said, my words razor-sharp, laced with sarcasm and restrained fury. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, my pulse a relentless drumbeat in my ears. She nodded, her lips trembling as if she might collapse under the weight of her own betrayal. "It wasn't like that. She began. "Don't," I cut her off, my tone icy. "I don't care what it was like. There's no excuse." She sank onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders sagging as though the guilt had become too much to bear. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never thought it would come to this." Her apology hung in the air, hollow and meaningless. Her excuses didn't matter, none of them did. What mattered was the choice she had made, deliberate and calculated. As I looked at her, memories began to surface, fragments of moments I had dismissed, the subtle shifts in her behavior, the growing distance, the tiny lies I had brushed aside as insignificant. This wasn't a mistake. It was a betrayal woven into the fabric of our lives. Every stolen moment, every feigned smile, every reassuring word had been a thread in her deception. She hadn't stumbled into this. She had chosen it. She had chosen him. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. The anger coiled tighter in my chest, but I forced it down. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. "Do you love him?" The question escaped before I could stop it. I wasn't sure why I needed to know, but I did. How deep did her betrayal run? She didn't answer right away. Her eyes dropped to the crumpled sheets, her fingers fidgeting with the fabric. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I don't know." Her hesitation cut deeper than any admission of love could have. How could she destroy everything we had built and not even understand why? But maybe she did. Maybe pretending not to know was easier than facing the truth. I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Words would only fuel a fire I wasn't ready to control. I turned toward the door, stopping just short of leaving the room. One last question lingered, unspoken but insistent. "Where does he fit into all of this?" My voice was measured, almost too calm, as if I had already made peace with the storm raging inside. Her face paled and she stammered, He was supposed to be a backup. The words stumbled out of her mouth as though she could hardly believe them herself. A backup, I repeated, the word reverberating in my mind louder than her voice. She hadn't just betrayed me, she had planned for this. She had mapped out every step, ensuring she wouldn't end up alone. And in that moment, the truth crystallized. I wasn't the one who had been deceived. She was. It was time to change the rules. I cast her one last look before walking out, my thoughts racing ahead to what came next. Revenge wouldn't be impulsive. It would be calculated, deliberate, and cold. The rest of the evening passed in a haze, the house that once felt like home now mocking me with its familiarity. The photos, the furniture, the trinkets she had chosen to make it ours, they were now meaningless relics of a life that no longer existed. Each glance at the room reminded me of the bitter truth. I needed to channel my anger, to sharpen it into something useful. Revenge wasn't just an option anymore. It was a necessity. The rage solidified into something precise and unyielding. This wasn't merely about the affair. It was about the lies, the manipulation, and her cold disregard for everything we had built together. That demanded retribution. I retreated to my office, sinking into my chair as the soft glow of the laptop screen broke through the darkness. Slowly, methodically, I began planning. She wouldn't walk away from this unscathed, not after what she had done. The first step was simple. I needed to know everything about him, his name, Calder. I had heard her whisper it, low and secretive, as though it were sacred. That name was seared into my mind now. I began my search. Social media was enough to give me a starting point. A man in his mid-30s, dressed sharply, smirking in front of an upscale restaurant. He carried himself like someone who thought he was untouchable. I didn't need much to start, just a thread. And if there was one thing I excelled at, it was unraveling threads people thought were safely hidden. Calder wouldn't see me coming. But first, there was her. She needed to understand what she had done, to feel the consequences of underestimating me. I wouldn't yell, I wouldn't beg. I would take control, and she would realize just how little power she had left. I stood in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes with mechanical precision. The repetitive motion grounded me, kept my thoughts focused. I thought of those who had let anger consume them, who had lost themselves in the chaos. That wouldn't be me. This was a game, and I intended to win. I heard her moving in the next room, likely rehearsing some desperate apology she thought might undo this, but I wasn't ready to hear her. Not yet. She could wait. She didn't deserve my attention until I decided she did. She entered the kitchen with red, swollen eyes and cheeks still streaked with dried tears, her pain etched into every line of her face. She looked fragile, like a cracked vase on the verge of crumbling. I felt a flicker of sympathy, but only a flicker. "Can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice thin and burdened with regret. I kept my eyes fixed on the sink, the sound of running water a buffer against her words. "What's left to say?" I replied, letting my apathy coat each word. Her voice wavered as she tried again. "I messed up," she admitted, her words brittle and fragile. "I never wanted to hurt you. Please, believe me." But belief had long since fled. I turned off the tap, carefully placing the plate I had been rinsing onto the rack. "No," I said firmly, my voice devoid of compromise. Her face fell, but she stayed silent. The unspoken tension between us grew heavier, suffocating. This wasn't just anger anymore. It was something colder, something that had settled deep within me. "I've given it a lot of thought," I began, my tone steady and deliberate. "About you. About us." Her expression shifted to one of unease. "What do you mean?" she asked hesitantly. Finally, I turned to face her, leaning against the counter with crossed arms. I let the silence stretch, savoring the weight of it before speaking again. "I'm done, Stella," I said, each word sharp and deliberate, like the snap of a breaking rope. "Done?" she echoed, panic creeping into her voice. "No, we can work this out. We can fix it." "No," I interrupted, my tone cutting her off like a slammed door. "There's nothing to fix. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." My words hit her like a slap, and she recoiled. Her hands trembled as she reached out, desperate to close the widening gap between us. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't do this. I love you. I know I made a mistake, but it wasn't supposed to go this far." I stepped back, shaking my head slowly. My expression was more disdain than sorrow. "No, Stella. This wasn't a momentary lapse. A mistake is accidental. This was intentional, repeated." Her eyes widened as the truth struck her. 4 months, right? I asked, my voice a blade slicing through the silence. She couldn't look at me, her gaze falling to the floor. Her silence was the confirmation I needed. "I've had plenty of time to think," I continued, each word measured and icy. "You wanted an alternative, a fallback? Fine. But now, I'm the one calling the shots." Her complexion paled as the weight of my words settled over her. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a reckoning. "I'm going to dismantle everything you thought you had," I said, my voice a cold whisper of intent. "And Calder? He's about to understand exactly who he's crossed." Her breathing grew erratic, panic overtaking her composure. But it was too late. The pieces were already in motion. She could see it now, but there was no undoing what had been set into motion. The silence that followed was unbearable, her fear radiating in the stillness. But I felt nothing, no pity, no remorse. She had chosen this path, and now she would face the consequences. Every word I had spoken, every action I was about to take, had been meticulously planned. Behind me, she shifted uneasily, clinging to the hope of undoing the inevitable. But there was no turning back. This was her new reality, one where I held all the power. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice barely audible. What are you going to do?" Her tone was small, almost childlike. Gone was the confident woman I once knew. She was reduced to fear and uncertainty. Her question stirred something within me, but it wasn't mercy. It was satisfaction. Actions had consequences, and she was only now beginning to grasp that truth. I didn't answer immediately, letting her stew in the oppressive silence. Picking up my phone, I turned it over in my hand, my movements slow and deliberate. The glow of the screen caught her eye as I dialed. Her breathing hitched, her panic palpable as she realized what was happening. She moved closer, her lips parting to object, but I raised a hand without looking at her. The message was clear: stay out of it. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered. "Calder," I said, my tone calm but laced with venom. There was a brief pause, then a hesitant chuckle. "Who is this?" he asked, confusion dripping from his voice. "Let's call me a concerned husband," I replied, my words cutting like glass. "You and I need to discuss some boundaries." Behind me, I heard her sharp intake of breath as the gravity of the situation hit her. She inched closer, desperation radiating from her, but it was far too late to change the course of events. This was my stage, and I was in control. "Listen," Calder began, his tone shifting to defensive. "I don't know who you think you are, but—" "Save it," I interrupted, my voice low and menacing. "I know everything." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could almost hear the pounding of his heartbeat. When he finally spoke, his voice was edged with fear. "Who the hell is this?" "You know exactly who I am," I replied, my calm demeanor masking the storm beneath. "I'm the man whose marriage you helped destroy, and now you'll regret every second of it." I heard him curse under his breath, his bravado crumbling. But I wasn't done. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, my tone as cold as a winter's night. "You're ending this, tonight. Afterward, you'll stay as far away from her as humanly possible. If you don't, I'll expose every skeleton you've buried." The silence stretched once more, suffocating and final. Calder had no comeback, and behind me, Stella stood frozen in place. This was no longer a matter of betrayal. It was about power, and now, I held every card in the deck. I wasn't bluffing. Every detail was falling into place, the threads already beginning to unravel. Each strand, though faint, was there to be tugged. Careless actions, fleeting indiscretions, whispered rumors of shady dealings. The path was barely visible, but it was enough. "I'm not sure what you're trying to do here," Calder said, his usual confidence slipping. There was a quiver in his voice, a crack in his armor. "You've got nothing. Absolutely nothing." "Wrong," I interrupted, my voice cold and cutting. "I know about the job you were fired from last spring, the affairs you thought were so well hidden, and those backdoor deals you've been pushing through under the radar. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending to be clean." The silence on the other end was deliberate and suffocating. I could almost hear his unease, feel his composure faltering. "I've done my research, Calder," I continued, the words sharp as glass. "I know exactly who you are, and if I want to, I can pull your entire world apart, piece by piece." The pause stretched taut. His breathing hitched, panic beginning to seep in. The bravado was crumbling. All right," he finally stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'll stop. I'll shut it down tonight. Just don't destroy me, all right?" A satisfied smirk tugged at the corner of my lips. The trap had closed. "You don't set the terms here," I said, my tone like tempered steel. "You'll end it. Then you'll disappear. If you don't, I'll make sure this follows you for the rest of your miserable life." Another moment of silence hung in the air, weighted with inevitability. Finally, he exhaled in resignation. "Fine," he said, his voice hollow, defeated. "It's done. I get it." "Good," I replied, hanging up with a deliberate click. The sound was final, an unyielding punctuation. When I turned around, Stella was standing there, frozen. Her face had gone pale, her expression an uneasy mix of fear and disbelief. She had witnessed everything. This version of me, calm, calculated, entirely in control, was a stranger to her, but it was who I had become. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" I asked, my words dripping with disdain. "Did you believe you could deceive me and come away unscathed?" Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. She knew there was no point. Everything was written plainly on my face. This wasn't about forgiveness or compromise. This was about power, and for the first time, it was entirely in my hands. "Calder is out of the equation," I said, studying her face for any sign of hope. "But you? You're still here, and you're going to regret everything. Trust me. You'll see." Her expression twisted, confusion flickering in her eyes. But I didn't allow her the space to process. I wasn't finished, not even close. This was just the beginning. The days that followed were unbearable, each one dragging on endlessly. The house was stifling, weighed down by oppressive silence. Stella's desperation to fix things was evident in every move she made. But she was lost. There was no way forward for her, not after this. Meanwhile, I had already set the next phase of my plan into motion. What I had done to Calder? That was only the opening act. Now it was Stella's turn. Outwardly, I maintained a facade of normalcy, moving through life as if nothing had shifted. But inside, I was a different person entirely. Every glance I cast her way was cold and impassive. Beneath the surface, my anger simmered, controlled but ever present. I refused to let it erupt. This was a game of patience, and I was willing to play it as long as it took. She tried, though, desperately. There were attempts to bridge the gap, to mend what had been broken. Dinners left waiting when I returned. Handwritten notes left in conspicuous places. Tears, more than I had ever seen from her. She seemed to believe that enough regret, enough pleading, might soften me, might bring me back. But her words were meaningless now. While she slept at night, I stayed awake, strategizing. The first step was simple. I reached out to Kevin, an investigator I had collaborated with during a complex deal years ago. "I need your help," I told him. He didn't press for details. I laid out the task, uncover everything, her past, her connections, and whether Calder was part of a larger pattern. Kevin delivered swiftly. A week later, his report arrived in my inbox. Reading it was like a blow to the chest. Calder wasn't her first, not even close. A string of names followed, some familiar, others unfamiliar. This wasn't a single mistake. It was a habit, a pattern that spanned years. But Calder? He stood apart. He wasn't just another affair. He was the linchpin, the thread that tied it all together. I sat there for a long time staring at the damning evidence, the enormity of it sinking in. This required precision, If I acted rashly, Stella might retreat or close herself off. But if I paced myself, I could dismantle everything she had built. Late one night, my phone buzzed. Kevin was on the other end, his tone measured and cautious. "I found something new," he said. "You'll want to hear this in person." I straightened in my chair, instantly alert. "Tell me now," I demanded. The pause that followed was deliberate, laden with gravity. "It's about Calder," he finally said. "He's not just some random fling, Lewis. I dug deeper like you asked. Turns out he's connected to your wife's father." The words hit me like a freight train. For a moment I couldn't breathe. "What kind of connection?" I asked, my voice taut. Kevin's exhale was slow, deliberate. "I don't have the whole picture yet, but from what I've uncovered, it seems Calder and your father-in-law were involved in some questionable dealings years ago. It's murky, and from the looks of it, it's not just about business." My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles ached. Kevin's voice cut through the haze. "If you want me to keep digging, just say the word." Brace yourself for what I'm about to reveal. This isn't a straightforward situation. It's a labyrinth far more intricate than I ever imagined. A chill of nausea crept over me. My father, the man who shaped my world and taught me how to forge my own, was no stranger to sidestepping boundaries. But this was something altogether different. Discovering Stella's affair was devastating enough, a betrayal that felt irreparable. But now, that treachery was laced with something far more sinister, something that reached into the foundations of my family. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" I asked, my voice low. Kevin hesitated for only a moment, and that pause said it all. "I have the documents, the emails, the financial records. It's all there," he said, his voice hardening. "Louis, if you're serious about making a move, this is the way to do it." I leaned back in my chair and shut my eyes, letting his words sink in. Calder wasn't just a cheating parasite. He was a piece of something much larger. And my father? He was entangled right in the middle of it. I hadn't yet decided how this revelation would align with my plan for Stella, but one thing was certain. The stakes had soared. This wasn't just about exposing her and Calder. It was about obliterating everything they believed they had constructed. And if it meant severing ties with my own family, I was ready. The rest of the night passed in a fog of relentless analysis. I sat at my desk, sketching diagrams, mapping connections, and plotting my next steps. My thoughts raced ahead of me, but one thing crystallized. When I made my move, it would be decisive. Stella had no inkling. Calder was already buckling under the strain. And my father? He wouldn't even see it coming. The days crawled forward with unbearable slowness. Stella kept up appearances, preparing meals and leaving behind small gestures of remorse like scattered breadcrumbs. But her eyes betrayed her unease. She was unraveling. She clung to the idea that sheer effort could mend the fractures, but I saw through the act. Her words rang hollow. Her touches were devoid of meaning. She was desperate but too afraid to confront what I knew or how far I'd go. The silence between us spoke louder than any confrontation. Her fear was tangible, and I let it fester. Everything was now in place. Kevin had surpassed expectations, delivering not just the information I requested, but a veritable arsenal. The connection between Calder and my father was more than just a thread. It was a weapon. Stella thought this was about an affair. She couldn't fathom the scale of the reckoning I was preparing. I spent hours crafting the message to Calder. It had to be flawless, precise, calculated, and merciless. I wanted him to feel the weight of what was coming. Each word was chosen with deliberate care as I typed. "I know about the affair, but I also know more, something that ties you to my father. Don't test me." My thumb hovered over the send button. Then I added the final line. "This is your only chance. Walk away from her. Walk away from this life. I'll keep your secrets. If you stay, you'll regret it forever." This wasn't a threat. It was a promise. My approach to my father would be entirely different. He had no idea I'd been investigating, and I intended to keep that advantage as long as possible. To him, I sent a curt message. "We need to talk. I found something unexpected. Meet me at 9 p.m. You'll want to hear this. No further details." He'd understand. We had always communicated efficiently, and a message like that would unsettle him. and unsettled people are prone to mistakes. The hours leading up to 9 p.m. dragged endlessly, the anticipation pressing down like a weight. Stella left the house with her usual excuse of a business dinner. I didn't question it. She wasn't working. She was likely venting to a friend, painting herself as the victim of a cold and distant husband. Let her. She thought I was weak, that I'd cave. She couldn't have been more wrong. At 8:50, I heard the unmistakable hum of my father's car in the driveway. True to form, he was punctual to the minute. I opened the door before he could knock, watching as he approached under the porch light. His suit was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled. "Louis," he said gruffly as he stepped inside without hesitation. "You've been distant. What's this about?" I let him talk, letting him believe for a few moments longer that he still held control. But inside, I was already calculating. He had taught me everything: how to navigate power, manipulate situations, and bend people to my will. Now, the game had turned. "Sit down," I said, my tone unyielding. His eyes narrowed, searching mine for answers, but I gave him none. After a brief pause, he lowered himself into the chair across from me. "This isn't like you," he said, suspicion lacing his words. "What's going on?" I let the silence stretch, the tension building like a coiled spring. Seconds ticked by, heavy and deliberate. He shifted, the cracks in his confidence beginning to show. Finally, I leaned forward. "I uncovered something," I began, my voice steady and deliberate. "Something about you, something that links you to Calder." His expression hardened instantly, but a flicker of panic betrayed him beneath the surface. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice faltering ever so slightly. That small fracture was all I needed. "The deals," I said, my tone unyielding. "The money transfers, the emails, the hidden transactions." His complexion turned ashen. "You thought I wouldn't find out, but I did. And now," I leaned back, letting my words hang in the air, "I get to decide what happens next." The silence was suffocating. He clenched his jaw, his eyes darting in search of an escape that didn't exist. "Listen," he began, his voice thin and strained. "It's not what you think. I was protecting the family. Calder, he's a businessman. I didn't know he'd get involved with Stella. I swear, Louis, I didn't know." His excuses spilled out, disjointed and desperate. But they didn't matter. His betrayal cut deeper than Stella's ever could. He was my father. I had trusted him. "I don't care about your justifications," I said, standing as my words loomed over him. "You crossed a line. Both of you did." I leaned in closer, towering over him as he sank deeper into the chair, his figure shrinking, suddenly exposed and defenseless. The balance of power in the room shifted decisively, falling into my hands. His eyes flickered with indignation, but beneath it, a shadow of fear began to stir, reaching into his composure. That was the reaction I needed. He understood now. My father's gaze locked onto mine, his shock apparent, the realization of a man who had lived his life believing he was untouchable. For the first time, he was forced to reckon with the weight of his own arrogance. My voice cut through the silence with precision. "Everyone will know," I declared, letting the weight of each word settle. "Everyone." I stepped closer, my tone lowering like a blade being drawn. "And don't think for a second that I won't drag you down with her." He opened his mouth, a rebuttal forming, but I silenced him with a swift gesture. "Don't," I said firmly, my voice laced with finality. "This is done." His shoulders sagged, resignation overtaking him as the gravity of his defeat weighed him down. The empire he had so painstakingly built over decades was now crumbling, and there was no escaping the truth. He rose slowly, his head bowed, and shuffled toward the door, his movements heavy with reluctance. The click of the door shutting behind him left the room still and quiet. I stood motionless, the enormity of what had just occurred settling over me like a storm breaking. The first strike had landed, and there was no retreat from this path. After days of careful preparation, the chain of events had begun. Every piece had fallen into place. Now, the final act awaited. This confrontation wouldn't merely expose Stella and Calder's deception. It would dismantle their entire facade, leaving nothing concealed. That morning, I reviewed every detail once more. The investigator's report lay open on my desk, an intricate map of betrayal laid bare. Emails, financial trails, photographs from surveillance. Not a single thread had been left loose. Stella's treachery, Calder's collusion, and my father's complicity, all exposed. But unveiling the truth alone wasn't enough. I wanted a moment so shattering, so undeniable that there would be no way to escape its repercussions. That's why I summoned them all. The invitations were deliberately vague, designed to pique curiosity without arousing suspicion. I framed it as a formal company event, an announcement about upcoming ventures. The bait was perfect. Stella, Calder, and my father would all attend. By 6 p.m., everything was in place. The venue was a modern, understated private event space downtown, sleek, professional, and neutral. A light spread of hors d'oeuvres and a projector setup lent an air of legitimacy. There was no reason for them to suspect what was coming. As guests began to arrive, I positioned myself near the entrance, watching the clock. At the precise moment, Stella arrived first. Her heels tapped against the polished floor, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. Her face paled. "Why am I here?" she asked, her voice brittle. I held her gaze, unblinking. "You'll see soon enough," I said evenly. She lingered near the doorway, her hesitation palpable as though debating whether to leave. Moments later, Calder entered. He moved with his usual swagger, confidence dripping from every gesture. His eyes landed on Stella, lingering slightly too long, a silent proclamation of dominance. Then he turned to me. The smirk disappeared. Finally, my father arrived. He hesitated in the doorway, his gaze darting around the room as though scanning for danger. The unease on his face was unmistakable. The man I had confronted days ago had vanished. What remained was a diminished version, braced for the inevitable. I stepped forward, letting the door close behind him with a soft click. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady, carrying authority. "I'm sure you're wondering why you're here." Stella shifted uneasily. Calder crossed his arms. My father fixed his gaze on me, his expression impenetrable. I allowed the tension to thicken before continuing. "Consider this," I said, pausing for effect. "A lesson in consequences." I pulled a remote from my pocket and clicked it. The projector hummed, illuminating the screen. The first slide appeared, emails between Calder and my father, rife with coded language and blatant incriminations. Stella's sharp intake of breath punctuated the silence. Calder's jaw tightened. My father's hands gripped the chair, his knuckles whitening. I took my time, guiding them through each detail with calculated precision. Every revelation landed with deliberate weight. The covert deals, the concealed transfers, the lies that had propped up their schemes. Everything was there. "This," I said, motioning to the screen, "is the foundation you thought you could build behind my back." Calder squirmed, his eyes darting to Stella as if seeking reassurance. She offered none. "And now," I continued, locking eyes with my father, "it's the foundation that will destroy you all." His mouth opened, but I silenced him with a raised hand. "I'm not finished." Another click brought the next slide, a series of photos of Stella and Calder, captured in compromising moments they thought were hidden. Each image struck like a hammer. Stella's face drained of color, her expression collapsing into despair. Tears welled in her eyes. "Stella," I said, my voice steady, "this isn't just betrayal. You didn't just cheat. You destroyed our marriage. You tore apart everything we built together. For what?" Her gaze met mine, desperate and broken, but no words came. I turned to Calder. "And you," I said, my voice hardening, "are not just a homewrecker. You're a fraud, a parasite who preys on others and masks it as charm." Chaos erupted. Stella's sobs broke the silence, her apologies disintegrating into incoherent cries. Calder stammered denials, his hands raised in a futile gesture. My father sat motionless, ashen-faced, the weight of his guilt bearing down on him. But I wasn't done. Holding the remote aloft, I delivered the final blow. "Before any of you try to excuse yourselves," I said, "watch this." The screen flickered to a video. The grainy footage showed Calder in his office, speaking dismissively to someone off camera. "She's just a pawn," he sneered. "I used her, got what I needed. When I'm done, she'll be nothing." Stella's sobs grew louder. She turned to Calder, her face contorted with betrayal. "You used me," she whispered, her voice cracking as she stepped away. Calder stayed silent. He didn't need to speak. The truth had already filled the room. My father tried to rise, perhaps to salvage what remained of his dignity, but I stopped him with a glance. "You all lied. You cheated. You ruined everything good in your lives," I said, my voice unwavering. "Now you'll face the fallout." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out, leaving them to confront the wreckage of their choices. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, and for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. The weight of the lies was gone. The truth had been set free. I inhaled deeply, savoring the freedom, and walked to my car. As I drove away, my phone buzzed. A message from Megan lit up the screen. "Thank you for telling me the truth. He's out of my life for good." A small smile crept onto my face. The game was over. I had won.